that I want to talk about today, but I'm really short on time, so forgive me, I'm going to move on to my flashes. And as the final speaker for side proposition, I'm going to be analyzing this debate on three main fronts. Number one, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to be asking, why is the government that needs to protect these indigenous languages? In my second question, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to examine whether or not this is in accordance with the purpose of education. And in my third and final question, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to talk about the social implications of our policy today. So moving on to my first flash, about why it should be the government. Now, something that we've heard from Team Singapore today is about how the government that's in power right now is not the government that persecuted these people in the past, so they have no responsibility to help these individuals. But Mr. Speaker, we have 2 points of refutation. Number one, when we examine policies that are already being implemented in the status quo today, we see that governments are actively taking responsibility for the wrongs that they have committed in the past. Our first speaker came up to the podium and he told you about how in America there's affirmative action policies for African Americans. Because in the past, it was the government that denied them the right to education. It was the government that denied them those kinds of opportunities. And that's why the government, using tax dollars, is owning up to their faults right now. No, thank you, sir. But the second reputation that we have, Mr. Speaker, is that we think that in this situation, it's the government that's going to be held to a particular wrong. Because when we look at examples like Australia, we see that what the government there did was, they tried to integrate their Aborigines with the majority culture. They married them off, no thank you, sir. And that's why at the point Australia's Aboriginal culture was such at a major low. Because the government had implemented policies that cracked down on them and such. And we think that when the government is such a large actor in detracting from those cultures in the past, it should obviously have a moral responsibility to own up for it in the present. But another issue under this classroom, Mr. Speaker, that I'd like to tackle has to do with whether or not this is an efficient use of funds, and whether or not there are other ways to fix this indigenous language problem. And we've heard from Team Singapore about how we can use museums and linguistic documents. No, thank you, sir. But we have 3 things I would like to say, Mr. Speaker. Number one, we think that right now campaigns in the status quo, such as raising awareness, raising recognition, museums and linguistic documents, have not been effective. That's why we see an increasing trend in these indigenous languages becoming more and more extinct. Because we see, Mr. Speaker, not only are these policies extremely expensive, but another problem is, no thank you, sir, is that they don't really tackle the fundamental problem with languages. Because you need your younger generation to speak those things. And it's the younger generation that's going to grow up and teach those languages to the future generations. No, thank you, sir. And when you don't have that kind of grassroots policy, you're never going to solve those problems. But the second level of response that we have, Mr. Speaker, is that educating teachers, while it might take a lot of money right now, is the best way. Because when these governments use their resources to make teachers for these indigenous schools, what happens is that those teachers go on to teach their students. And that's how the students can learn these kinds of languages from a very young age. It becomes incorporated into their education curriculum. And that's why they're going to go on and continue to speak it as they become older. So even if it takes a lot of money right now, we actually think that it yields the best results in the long run. No, thank you, sir. But our third and final response is that they've told us about how NGOs and international organizations can do this anyways. But we see, Mr. Speaker, that in these nations, the entity with the most power, with the most manpower, and the largest scale of influence is the government. And that's why even if the government receives aid from these organizations like UNESCO, it still needs to be a principal actor, because no other entity can have the same degree of power in the nation as the government does. And that's why this first flash about why government has quite clearly been taken by some opposition today. No, thank you, sir. Because number one, we've shown you about how governments in the status quo are owning up for their mistakes in the past, and that's why it should be done in this situation. But number two, Mr. Speaker, we've also told you about how this is the best use of funds.
If the cost of keeping a language alive is less minorities with university degrees and jobs, then we'd rather the language die.
Mr. Speaker, my second question I'm going to explain to you about why teaching these indigenous languages is not going to have an adverse effect on these people's education. But that moves on accordingly to my second flash about whether or not our policy is in accordance with the purpose of education. Now, another principal argument that we've heard from Team Singapore today is about how if we teach these kids these kinds of educations, it's not going to prepare them for real life. But Mr. Speaker, we have 2 levels of response. Number one, in my country back in Korea, they only teach me in Korean. But look at me now on the international stage, eloquent and wonderful. Just to learn international colloquiations. But the second level of response that we have, Madam Speaker, is that languages, no thank you, sir, are a medium. They're the medium through which these kinds of subject matters are taught. So we think that regardless of what language you use, the subject matter itself does not change. No thank you, sir. And even if you say that words like photosynthesis don't exist in the indigenous language, then make a word for it. A characteristic of language is that they evolve and adapt to the status quo. We think, no thank you, sir, that if these languages make new words, it's simply going right. That's what languages are supposed to do, evolve and adapt. And that moves on, Madam Speaker, no thank you, sir, to another issue under this clash. Whether or not parents are making the best decisions for their children, and whether or not they're being pressured to send their children to school. Now, Mr. Speaker, we have two things that we'd like to say on this issue.
So,
Number one, Mr. Speaker, we think it's rather contradictory. No, thank you, sir. The Team Singapore at one point comes onto the podium and says, these languages are dying, they're extinct, we should leave them alone. But then another speaker comes up and says, if these parents teach these languages at home, it's really easy to preserve them. We're not really sure what stance they're trying to take in this debate. But the second level of response that we have on this issue, no, thank you, sir, is this. We think that it's within the parents' best interests to teach their children, to give their children the best education. And we think that when these children, and they're learning an indigenous language, and can receive support from the family, from their home, that's when the best kind of education is going to happen. No, thank you, sir. We see that one of the problems with minority cultural education right now in the status quo is that even if these children learn material at school, when they come back home, they're not able to receive reinforcement on those subject matters. Their parents aren't able to help them, review their homework and such. But we think that when these kids are being taught in an indigenous language, in which their parents can help them as well, we think that that's what's best for their education. And that's why the second clash about whether or not our policy today is in accordance with the purpose of education has quite clearly been taken by side competition. Because number one, we've shown you about how it's not going to be bad to these children's education. And number two, we've proven to you about how it's actually going to be better. Yes, sir.
Sir, the reason you're eloquent and wonderful is because you study English rather than an endangered indigenous language which doesn't have functional value for your future in society.
Mr. Speaker, we think that just because you teach an indigenous language doesn't mean that your school cannot teach the predominant regional language in your region. We don't understand why Team Singapore constantly tries to tell us that if these kids learn indigenous languages, that's the only language that they're going to speak for the rest of their lives. But moving on to my third and final flash, Mr. Speaker, about the social implications that are going to occur under our policy. Now, something that we've heard from Team Singapore today is about how there's going to be a lot of social backlash because these kids aren't going to be able to fit in their communities. Well, Mr. Speaker, we have two things we'd like to say about this. Number one, our second speaker today came up to the podium, and she explained to you about how right now in the status quo, when these children are being forced to attend schools that don't teach in their indigenous languages, but teach in other, rather foreign languages, that's when they're not able to be integrated into society. Because not only is there an extremely large language barrier, but we also see that they're not able to find their own identity. And that's why when these schools offer them the chance to learn these indigenous languages, they're able to find their social identity, and they're able to remove that barrier of language and become more in tone with the education. But the second level of response, Mr. Speaker, that we have is that a unique advantage is provided to these children when they learn these indigenous languages at school. Because when these children are living their lives day to day, and when they're communicating with other people in society, they're going to predominantly use that region's language. So not only do they learn their indigenous language, but they learn the regional language as well. So we think that it's really good for them on a two-pronged approach. And that's why this third and final clash about the social implications has also been taken by side proposition today. Because we've shown you about how we're going to give these children a really comprehensive education. Mr. Speaker, today Team Singapore hasn't really engaged in this debate. They've constantly told us that preserving culture is important, but they really haven't told us how. In elementary school, Mr. Speaker, I learned about ostriches, who stick their heads in the ground whenever a problem comes along. And looks at Team Singapore's face, they learn about ostriches